Under the realist approach, we have first extreme realism, which is sometimes called idealism. Idealism is the position associated with Plato. Extreme realism idealism regards the ideal form as primary or real, while treating sensible forms, particulars, as less real approximations of the ideal. For Plato, the world of particulars is a kind of shadow world where we do not encounter reality per se, but merely clues to ultimate reality. There is a sense in which the material world is somewhat defective or an imperfect form of the real because we cannot get at the absolute without getting past the veil of unreality, which is the consequence of being immersed in the sensible world. Plato's attitude towards civil life, his desire for a perfect state run by philosopher kings who impose an ideal upon the imperfect sensible world, his tendency to emphasize geometry rather than biology, and his relative lack of interest in the sciences for their own sake are all very easy to understand in light of this attitude towards form. For Plato and all idealists to one degree or another, there is a realm of immutable perfect forms, which is the basic explanatory tool for understanding this world. Universals are located in this immaterial realm, whereas they are only partially realized in sensible things. As sensible things come into being, change, and go out of existence, they are acquiring being from their ideal form, realizing it in various degrees, and losing it. Plato's explanation of change and being is in part a response to Heraclides and Parmenides' positions on those issues. Parmenides said that things have being, and therefore that change must be an illusion, while Heraclides treated change as the reality and viewed stasis as an illusion. Plato attempts to solve the paradox by making being immutable and material reality only quasi-being, thus preserving the stasis of form while allowing the flux of matter, which acquires or loses being inasmuch as it acquires or loses form. But this explanation, as shown above in the case of triangles, is not satisfactory, and indeed self-contradictory, not to mention that it seems to violate our common sense and ring a bit false. The second realist approach I'm going to outline is a moderate realism. And this is the Aristotelian form of realism, and the dominant realist view in the world today. Scholastic thinkers of the Middle Ages, although disagreeing on a huge number of issues, would tend to defend the following points at least. Form is real, that is to say, there are universals, but these universals only exist in specific beings. Dogness is not floating around in a realm of Platonic forms, but comes to exist whenever it is instantiated or given being by the active being of some dogs. All dogs have a certain common nature that makes them dogs, but this nature is their being itself. It is not some separate reality apart from the dog itself. Likewise, triangularity is in the nature of all three-sided things, and the ideal form of triangles is just an abstraction from various particular things which are all individuals. It is not as if the abstraction itself is the form in the sense of being a thing on its own with its own reality. Rather, the particular real triangles are the reality, and if there were no triangular things, or no dogs, there could be no universal triangularity, dogness, treeness, etc., except perhaps in the mind of God. Aristotle's approach is obviously better than Plato's in that it doesn't remove the problems to some other immutable realm. Particulars are what we encounter in reality, and it is in particulars that any universal must be located. The Aristotelian approach to universals, therefore, does justice both to our common sense feeling that there are universals, and our sense that a realm of immutable forms is a non-answer. However, it doesn't really answer the problem, because one still wants to know what it is that is supposed to be universal between, say, this fox and that fox, when each is a separate individual instantiating its own active being. If we say that the universal form is some common being or entity which is shared by all dogs, trees, triangles, etc., then aren't we just reintroducing Plato through the back door? What is this common being? Moderate realism seems closer to the truth, but inadequate at the same time. We'll come back to this question later after surveying the other basic approach to universals, nominalism. Nominalism means just what it sounds like. All forms of nominalism assert, contrary to realism, that because there are only particular beings, there aren't really any universals in reality itself. There are different kinds of nominalism, and I'm not going to go into all of them, but here's a brief survey. Conceptualism. Conceptualism is a form of nominalism which asserts that reality itself contains no universals, that the beings that we place in categories, groups, or species don't really contain a common nature, but rather that these are all totally individuated particulars. However, we can develop abstract concepts and assign particulars to classes on the basis of these common concepts. So to the extent that you and I agree that a triangle and a square both contain the abstract quality of shapeness, a word which again only has meaning in reference to a certain network of abstractions that we agree on, then you and I can talk meaningfully about shapes, but only in a roundabout way, since we're really talking about our concepts of shapes. This is all very convenient for us, but in reality there isn't such a thing as a shape as such, or a dog as such. These are just names, hence nomen, for concepts. But those concepts are really inventions. They are useful fictions. They don't really tell us anything meaningful about reality per se. And a second kind of nominalism I'm going to go over is resemblance nominalism. Resemblance nominalism says that there aren't any universals, but to the extent that two particulars resemble each other, they can be assigned to a group with reference to an exemplar of that group, the exemplar being some kind of unreal abstraction. So Fido and Ruffy are both dogs, but only in that they resemble each other more than they do other things. This would seem to make resemblance relationship itself a universal, which, however, contradicts nominalism. To this it would be responded by the nominalist that each resemblance is a distinct resemblance of a distinct particular, and that resemblance itself is only an abstraction from these resemblances among totally unique instances of resemblance instantiated again by unique particulars. And if that sounds like a bunch of bullshit, I think it's because it is. But let's keep going. As the explanation shows, different kinds of nominalism tend to collapse into each other and amount to the same thing, namely the doctrine that there are no universal forms or natures in reality, and that the common or universal concepts we use to decipher the world are not real and are not located in the world, but simply in our minds. And that's the really important part. Nominalists don't accept that there are universals in reality, but that the concepts themselves correspond to a real referent in the world. Realists defend some variety of the following claim: that universals in language correspond to some, and in thought correspond to some real thing in the world. Okay. Having reviewed the various approaches to reality, let me say right away that I do not think any of them are quite correct, but each has certain merits. Platonism, extreme realism, correctly emphasizes the universality of certain kinds of knowledge, and that this universality must be somehow located in some part of reality. But it sweeps the problem of location under the table by assigning universals to some inaccessible realm of immutable forms, and it fails to treat particulars as fully real, whereas particulars are obviously the realest thing we encounter. I have never met triangleness, dogness, or a number 7, have you? Aristotelianism correctly locates universals in particular beings, and emphasizes that universals can only exist when instantiated in particulars. So it takes its cue from the real world and does not treat phenomenal reality as if it were somehow a shadowy illusion. It also accords with our basic common sense about the world, that categories of beings like shapes, trees, dogs, vegetation, buildings, etc. really exist in reality in some sense and are not just abstractions we invent. That when I say a skyscraper and the 7-Eleven are both buildings, I'm not saying something that has no referent except an idea in my head, that they are both buildings in some meaningful sense. On the other hand, Aristotelianism, moderate realism, fails to locate what common being or entity it might be, such that St. Bernards and foxes both have canineness, while grass and chipmunks do not enjoy animalness. What is the thing in common that dogs do have among themselves, but chipmunks and skyscrapers do not? Moderate realism seems to be on the right track, but at the end it seems to revert to idealism. Conceptualist nominalism doesn't really address the ontological question at all, and only poses an answer to the epistemological question. Is it really true that we regard two dogs as having some common nature only because we both form an abstract concept of dogness that isn't really related to dogs themselves? Then why did we form that concept about the same thing? Conceptualism asks us to pretend that we don't know something that we really do know, namely that St. Bernards and Dobermans do have some common something, that is the cause of our classifying them together, and that we wouldn't abstract the concept of dogness in the first place unless these two beings really did have something in common along those lines. Finally, resemblance nominalism correctly emphasizes that all beings are particulars or individuals. In reality, there is no such thing as an every man or an every dog or an every triangle. So if beings are just themselves, if A is A, as the principle of identity says, then A cannot be non-A, in which case, claims nominalism, two dogs cannot really be related in any ontological sense because they are different. We just associate them because of resemblance. However, each act of resemblance is distinct, and resemblance itself is a concept, not a universal. But this reverts to conceptualism and the idea that abstractions like dog, aircraft, and automobile have no referent in the world of things. But how can it be the case that they have no referent in the world of particulars if we use these concepts to understand the particulars, and if the particulars themselves cry out, so to speak, to be classified according to their common characteristics? Moreover, we know as a matter of experience that doggish things do cause other doggish things to come into existence, that they share many of the same physical parts, genes, etc., so it can hardly be seriously maintained that they have no ontological relationship to each other.